And good afternoon to everyone. My name is Armin Briegel, Senior Consulting Engineer responsible for the EMEA region. Generally, all around Netherlands, Germany, France, recently. Not so often the UK, so this is a great change. Today, I want to talk about APIs, and that's a lot to cover. We will be talking about a lot, so let's dive in and do it quickly. Just as an overview, I will introduce a few concepts and terminology so that those of you who don't have much experience with APIs get up to speed, and hopefully in the later part of the session understand what I'm talking about. Then I actually get to introduce something that's new or going to be new in the mid-near future, which I'm actually quite excited about. And after that theory, we're going to dive into practice and do some nice demos and start with some simple basic workflows, simple API calls, how do they work with shell scripts and other things. And then we'll build on top of that and look into Swift apps, and middleware, and build a really nice Ruby Goldberg machine that hopefully won't blow up in my face when I demo it. So what are APIs? What are we talking about? Just generally, the abbreviation is for Advanced Programmers Interface, and back in the days, I'm old, when I started programming, it meant basically two applications talking with each other, or an application talking with a system. Nowadays, when we talk about APIs, we generally mean talking to a web server somewhere and getting some information back from them. The APIs we use in Jamf, and most APIs across the board with other solutions as well, use what is called a representational state transfer, or REST, or RESTful API. That's just terminology. Which basically means you send an HTTP request to a server, get some information back, usually in JSON, sometimes it's XML, sometimes it's a different format, but generally in JSON these days. And the idea is we can talk, your applications, your scripts, your workflows, your other services can talk with our services to exchange data and move data back and forth in a scalable way. You can automate tasks, you can customize functionality, there's a certain workflow or a certain thing that we don't provide, but you can add it by using the API. Most importantly, you can integrate with other vendors' solutions. Identity management comes to mind, ticketing systems, documentation systems, all kinds of other workflows that we can integrate in with. And from these combinations, you can create new solutions for yourself, or if you're a service provider, solutions for your customers, or maybe even an app that you might be able to sell. There's a bit more terminology here. The example here for a restaurant order, right? You're talking with a server, get it? There's a few things you want to do, and this is usually from the group of create something, update something, read something, or delete something, and that's usually abbreviated as CRUD. So you want to create something, I want to create a new order with a server in this case. That would be a post or a creation. You want to read the information that the server has, so can I get the information about my order, please? Or change it. I want to change from ice cream to cake. So that's an update or a put request. And then in the end, you might want to delete the object or cancel the order. And that's a, delete request. We have a few objects here or things that we talk about. There's generally the resource, the item that I want information about. There's an endpoint, that's basically the address, the path in the URL that I talk with to get the information about that resource. And then what do I want to do with it? Get, post, put, delete. I'll mention these things a lot later on in the demo part, so just that we're all up to speed and understand what we're talking about here. We have a lot of APIs at Jamf, and that's really a good thing. We have so many that Jamf Pro actually has two. We have the classic API, which mainly works in XML. It can use JSON as well. And we have the modern API, and I checked, it's more than 10 years old by now as well, the modern API. New additions all go into the modern API. We are actually starting to deprecate endpoints in the classic API and actually starting to remove endpoints from the classic API. So if you have scripts that still use the classic API, just check on that. If you need to update the script to switch to the modern API. There are still some things the classic API does that are not reflected in the modern API, just to confuse things. But we are also starting to deprecate and remove things in the old API. Jamf School has a very powerful API. Jamf Protect also has an API. All the data available in Jamf Protect is accessible through an API. Jamf Security Cloud has a pretty basic API, but still it's useful for working with the Jamf Security Cloud and Jamf Safe Internet. So check those out. What would you use them for? Well, you're probably already using the API, even though you don't know it, because all the integrations that we provide in Jamf Pro and our other solutions with, say, an identity provider like Microsoft Entra ID or Okta are using their API and our API to send messages and information back and forth, to synchronize data between the systems. So integrations is a very important thing. If there's an integration that we don't provide, there might be a third-party API-based solution that provides an integration for you, or you can build your own. Automations is probably the most obvious idea. Tedious, repeating tasks are probably ripe for automation. They will go faster if you automate them with your own scripts, and it will reduce errors. Because humans make errors, and a well-written automation will at least produce less errors if it's well-written. Jamf Pro has the ability to send webhooks, which are just signals, API-based signals, to other API servers on certain events. The most common ones are at enrollment. When a new device enrolls, it will send a webhook, if you customize it that way, or when a smart group changes. And with smart groups, we can basically test for everything, so that is really, really useful. And these webhook triggers that go to a different server can start off automations there and do things. I will actually demo something like that later. Jamf Pro especially, but also Jamf School contains a lot of data that might be interesting. But if you want to really put that data into good analytics tools, or even something like Excel to have nice pie charts, you probably want to pull the data out using the API to automate the reporting and the importing and the display and use proper data analytics tools for that. Again, the API can help you doing that. Extensibility and customization. If there are workflows, if there are features that we don't provide that you'd like to have, building APIs can be as simple as a shell script, can be as complicated as a full-blown iOS or macOS app, or a web server that communicates with the Jamf APIs for the workflows and the extensibility that you want. And with that, you can build new solutions. Just for you, just for your organization, just for the admin team, maybe just for you personally, or for a wider audience. So there's something coming that's new. I teased it earlier. I said we have 4 or 5 APIs. And you have seen in the other sessions, we are working on things like blueprints, the compliance benchmarks, software updates. Everything is DDM-based, and we have this modular microservices approach. So instead of having 4 or 5 different APIs that you need to talk with, and to use these new features that are added as microservices, we are going to introduce yet another API. This is the XKCD comic with the 15 standards. But the goal is that this is the unifying one. We will start with either Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect, or Jamf School and Jamf Protect. So you will have an API with a single computer or a single mobile device resource and endpoint, and you will get data out of both Jamf Pro and Jamf Protect if you're using both services through a single API, through one authentication call. You don't have to have authenticate against 2 platforms. It will now be a single call. It will come out later this year. We don't know the timing yet exactly, and I will share at the end how you can sign up for the private beta that is currently running if you want to. As I said, we start with Pro plus Protect or School plus Protect, but eventually we want all APIs that we offer to merge into one unified gateway so that you have a single authentication into all of our APIs and all of the data you get through our services. And things like blueprints, compliance reporting, etc. will also go into that new unified API. Lots of theory. I think we're already bored. 10 minutes theory, that's enough. Let's start with some real-world practice. And the first thing is, if we're somewhat technical and want to use this, where do I find documentation? I will have at the end a slide with a single link to a page where I'm re-mentioning, relisting all of the links. So that's the one you will have to remember. But the one that you can remember, and it's not so hard, is developer.jamf.com. That has the documentation for all of our APIs with a full reference for all the endpoints and guides and pre-written code samples and a changelog. For Jamf Pro, there's something called the Swagger API, which is a dynamic interface that I can use in a web browser to directly interact with the data on your Jamf Pro server. And then, of course, we have the training catalog, the learning center, and I always like looking at the archive of JNUC presentations that we have on YouTube, because there's many, many people in different JNUC presentations who are showing how to use the API, but also specific solutions that they've built using the API. So, I am here on my computer, and developer.jamf.com, that's not my computer yet, that's just slides that I have in place. So developer.jamf.com, I will show that. We have the Swagger API. You go to your Jamf Pro server and add /API at the end, and that will get you to a different interface where you have the interactive access to Jamf Pro, which I'm just going to demo live in a moment. But there we can work with the live data on your computer. So this is my demo computer, and this is developer.jamf.com. So this is the website. We can see all of the APIs that I've mentioned before. There's one more that I didn't mention, Jamf Title Editor. If you don't know what that is, probably not necessarily bother about that. We can go into Jamf Pro, and as you can see, there's the classic API and the Jamf Pro API. I'm going into the Jamf Pro API. Here I have the reference of all of the endpoints, all of the data objects that are available through the API from Jamf Pro. I will use the categories for my demos today, because that's the simplest object that I could find in Jamf Pro. It has 3 data points, the ID, the name, and the priority. There are other objects like a computer or mobile device inventory detail, and that literally has hundreds, if not thousands, of data points attached to it, which is what makes it interesting, but it makes for very complicated demos, so I'm going to avoid that. I can see all the calls I can make, like I can add paging here, should you have hundreds of categories in your system. Which responses can I get? Like I could create a category record as well, and then I might get a different response. I can look at a more complicated object, like the computer inventory, and then I can see I have different things here. It will give me the curl command. So curl is a shell command that allows me to do HTTP requests. And it will give me a sample command here already, just from the documentation. You can even switch to other languages. If you prefer Swift or Python, you can switch to those and have the code samples in here. This is very nice. We have, under recipes, it's code samples. In this case, like the most common thing is, how do I get my authentication token? We have 2 ways in Jamf Pro, client ID and secret, and username and password. I'll talk about those a bit later. We have code samples for both. And then there's the changelog. So 11.18 just came out this week. We have the changes in here, or last week. We have the changes in here, see which endpoints were improved, which endpoints were removed, and which ones got new additions and available. So always on an update for Jamf Pro and our other services, look into the changelog on developer.jamf.com. I said earlier, if you go to your web server, to your Jamf Pro server, and add /API, you will come to this interface. This is a kind of secret web interface into your Jamf Pro. And again, I have the choice between the classic and the modern API. To actually interact with it, I have to authenticate. We have the option again, username, password, or client ID secret. Once I've authorized, I can look at the endpoints without authorizing, but if you want to interact with them, you need to authorize. My example of the categories again, I see all the different things that I can do with the categories. I want to just get the categories, and for the interactivity, try it out, and say execute. And then the output down here is actually all the categories that exist in my Jamf Pro. You're working on the live data of your Jamf Pro. So that's both good and bad, right? I mean, you're working with real-world data. If you're changing or deleting things, you're working with real-world data. So you all have a test instance, right? Use that first, and only move to the production when you're certain. Swagger API is also true, but it's very useful to explore and see what kind of JSON am I getting back, what kind of data do I get from this endpoint, or how do I need to prepare the data when you're updating or sending it there. And up here again, we get the curl command. The Swagger API only gives me the shell command, but if you're kind of fluent in other languages, this is the data you need in other languages as well. It's just a different kind of format. So this is the Swagger API. It's in every Jamf Pro. Just add /API. I've mentioned authentication as well. There's a lot of interesting data in Jamf Pro and Jamf School and Jamf Protect, and we don't just want anybody to access that data, even just for read access. And then with the API, I can do a lot of things. I can update data. I can send MDM commands. I can lock or even wipe devices with the API. So we really want to restrict access to that. The first API call you do in your automation usually sends username and password or client ID secret to get a token, and then it uses that token for subsequent API calls. The token is usually valid for 20 or 30 minutes, depending on how you set that up. And at the end, you can just renew it and get a new token that lasts longer if you have workflows that last for that long. In Jamf Pro, we have two things. We can use a normal Jamf Pro user account and password. If you have SSO set up for the user accounts, it won't use SSO. It will use the built-in password as a fallback, which might not be so ideal for your workflows. But that's why we have client ID secrets. Client ID secrets is just a special form of user accounts. They're easier to restrict. They're easier to reset. They're meant for dedicated API workflows or connections or integrations. I generally recommend using client ID secret for any workflows. Of course, in the demo, I'm not going to do that because the secrets you get are like, I don't know, 512 character randomized passwords, and I'm not going to type them for the demo. But generally, use client ID secret. They're easier to create and easier to discard or renew in case of when you need to do it. So this is an example for a shell script. And marketing cringes when I put code on slides already, so I'm going to keep it brief. I will have all the sample code available on the resources page later, where you can download it, run it, look at it in detail. So I'm going to break this down into 4 parts. The first part is we prepare the request. We prepare our authentication. In this case, we're using username password because this is the API call to get the authentication token. That's the one time we have to send the username and password or the client ID secret. But all the other API calls have the same structure. And we prepare the endpoint that we want to talk to. Then we actually send the request. In shell scripting, we're generally using the curl command to do an HTTP request, and then we have the post, the action that we're going to do, and the endpoint in there, and our authorization. There might be errors. The server might not be available. I might have a malformed endpoint. There might be errors. I have to handle the errors. It's a shell script, so I'm just printing something and exiting with an error. But we can see later the error handling can be a very complex part of my workflow. And if there isn't an error, what I get back from the server is a data blob of JSON data. JavaScript, serialized object notification, JSON data. You've seen it with all the square brackets and curly braces and many, many quotation marks. We can't work with that in Shell. We can't even directly work with that in other languages. We have to convert it into objects that my language can understand. In this case, I'm using plutil, plistUtil, a built-in tool on macOS to extract the token from the JSON. I will talk about some of these things later. So these are the 4 steps. We prepare the request, we send the request, ideally we get data back. If not, we need to handle the error. And then we parse the JSON data, and then we work with the JSON data. I mean, this is just getting the data. The actually really interesting thing happens afterwards when we have the data. So how does that look? I will go into terminal. All good things start with going into terminal, right? I can have a script here. Again, this script is in the resources, so you can look at that later. At first here, I get all the data I need, like what do I want to do? And then here, I have my get token function. And you can see in the comments, I have the prepare request phase up here. I have the send request here. I handle the error, and I parse the token. In this case, I'm not using plutil on my slide. I'm using a function that I prepared. And if I go into the main code, I have the actual workflow. In this case, I'm just getting the information about a computer with a given serial number, and I want the ID of that computer, because for subsequent API calls, I will need the ID of that computer. If I run this, and I do run the script, kind of anticlimactic. It will tell me, yeah, this is the serial number, and it has the ID 24. I will need that later. But this is a very simple script, 2 API calls, first to get the token, then to get the information. We're parsing the JSON. Oh, no, wait, there's more. This is a lot of script, right? Kind of a lot to do to just do these simple things. And wouldn't it be great if there was some tool that helped me do it? Well, a coworker of mine, Leslie Hillou, consulting engineer in the US, has written such a tool. It's called API Utility, or Jamf API Utility. It's available on Jamf Concepts. Concepts.jamf.com is a website where many of the engineers who aren't directly in development and product build and provide tools for everybody. And API Utility has a UI, and in this UI, I can set up connections to either Jamf Pro, Jamf School, or Jamf Protect. So it can talk with all 3 of these APIs. I can give them the URL of your server. Do I authenticate with username and password, client ID secret? Then enter the client ID secret, and I can add that. I've done that for my demo server. It will store the client ID secret in the keychain, so it's securely stored away in the macOS keychain. And then I can run that. So instead of doing the script, I can say, I want to work against my demo server, and I want the information from the endpoint API v1 categories. And we can get that URL from either, oh man, typing is hard on stage. I can get this endpoint URL from either developer.jamf.com or the Swagger API, and when I run that, I directly get back the JSON. So I don't have to do all of these extra steps that I showed in the shell. I can just use API util. So I said earlier the raw JSON is hard to parse in shell and hard to use. One of the great things is starting with macOS Sequoia, macOS 15, a tool called JQ, JSON Query. JQ is built into the operating system, or Apple pre-installs it for us. And I can go in and say, I want the results array, and from that, each and every name. And then it parses the JSON down for me. I can go in here and let's do a different endpoint. This is the one that I always mistype. Computers, inventory, detail. And we learned earlier the computer we're interested in is number 24. And this is a lot of JSON. A lot of data that I'm actually not interested in. So JQ to the rescue. I pipe that into JQ, and I want the hardware serial number, and I get just the serial number back. This is kind of verification. Earlier on, I got the ID from the serial number. Now I'm doing it the other way around. But API utility is a great help for doing these, and so is JQ to parse the JSON. API utility from concepts.jamf.com. Check it out. Just got an update last week. Very, very useful tool. We can use this to shorten down all of these things. This is great for experimentation, but you can actually put this in your scripts and use it in your scripts as long as the API utility app is installed. Parsing the JSON, I said, with macOS Sequoia and higher, macOS 15 and higher, Apple pre-installs JQ for us. You can, of course, download the JQ package or binary and install it on older systems if you want to use those. Otherwise, plist-util has JSON parsing built in since macOS Monterey, macOS 12, which is now 4 years old, if I do the math right, nearly 5. So if you have to support devices older than that, I'm sorry, but there's a way to do that with OSA script or JavaScript for automation, and I have links to do the documentation for that and sample code in the resources that I will share at the end of the session. Shell. This is the easy part. We're getting more complicated. Shell scripting is nice. It's accessible. I can run it with things like Jamf policies. It's really great. But you've heard me say it and allude to it. Shell is really bad for complex data structures. And other languages like Python, Go, Rust, Ruby, and yes, Swift are so much more useful for complex data structures. So it makes sense to graduate from shell scripting to something like Swift, Python, whatever, to work with these complex data objects that we get. I'm not going into the Swift code because that would take much longer, but the structure is the same, right? We have the same 4 steps. We prepare the request. There's objects in Swift that allow me to do that. I can use URL, URL components, and URL request to build my request. Then I send the request and get the data. Swift and the Apple native frameworks have an object called URL session to do that, and it's really useful and really powerful. I get the error back, and I get the URL response object back, which contains the data I get back from the server, but also things like HTTP status codes and other information I can use to actually dynamically react to the error and show useful error messages or do things to work with the error. And then for parsing the JSON data, we don't just want to extract a handful of strings. We use objects like JSON decoder and the codable protocol to actually transfer and translate the JSON data we get back into native Swift objects that we can work with all the power of using data in Swift. So to do that, I have prepared something, and I will change into a different folder. We can open this for now. This is, as you can see, it's a bit more complicated, a bit more involved. It's a basic command line tool that I wrote in Swift, which will take one argument and see if it can list the categories, list the computers, or list the scripts. And we can go in here and see the category objects because they're easy. I said earlier, category is really easy, ID, name, and priority. I have the endpoint. Here in the Jamf object protocol, I have the access that actually does the 4 steps that I mentioned earlier. So in here we have the prepare request and all of the other things in here. And again, the sample code is available in the resources. You can see that. When I go into terminal, I can run this. And again, it will do this. In this case, it parses out the JSON. It doesn't print me the JSON, but it parses out the data and gives me the ID and the name of the object. I can also do it for the computer. And I only have 2 computers in my demo instance, but you can see here, these are the IDs and the names of the computers that are from the, directly from the Jamf. It could use all of the other data as well. Using Swift in a command line tool is useful, and things like the API util command line tool is built in Swift as well. So this is already useful. But the nice thing about using Swift is that I can go ahead and build an app with a UI. I can use Swift UI to give the thing a user interface. Now you will see lots of discussions among Apple developers who have been building stuff for iPhone and Macs for decades about whether Swift UI is better than AppKit or not. But the point is, the level at which we Mac admins are writing tools, Swift UI is amazing. It just lowers the entry into writing user interfaces, apps with user interfaces, very, very much, and makes it accessible to people who haven't been building apps for decades. And I think that's very great. So in this case, I have an app, and I see here the list of computers, and if I click on each, I get the details. Very, very simple app. I have a tutorial online that is linked in the resources. A 6-part tutorial that builds up from building a command line tool in Swift to building this app. And because this is built in Swift UI, and Swift UI works cross-platform for iOS, iPadOS, and macOS, I can also go in and compile the same app for the iPhone. And of course, the UI looks a bit different on the iPhone because the screen is narrower and there's different, it's a touch interface. But Swift UI takes care of that for me. This is the same code as the Mac app, but I get the same functionality just with a slightly different user interface. So that's the advantage of using Swift and Swift UI. Mostly we can go and start building user interfaces. Most of my examples, all of my examples so far, were on macOS. Most of the time, that's what we're interested in. You can do really cool things on macOS with automation, right? We can't automate much stuff on iOS because, well, I can't run shell scripts on iOS. I can build apps for iOS, but they can't really access other stuff in the system. So I can't automate iOS stuff very much. Can I? Well, let's see. I have here, and I need to unlock it first, an iPad. I have a pin code on this iPad. This will be relevant. And I want to build automation on this. So this is a bit of a contrived Ruby Goldberg machine, but you will see how this applies to other automations you can do. As I said, this one has a pin code assigned to it. I want to go in, because the pin code is annoying, and remove it. And I have to end it 3 times or so to actually remove it, but that's OK. There we go. It's doing the thing of removing it. So the fact that the pin code is removed gets reported up to the Jamf Pro server. In a smart group in the Jamf Pro server will pick up, well, this one has its device passcode removed. That will send out a webhook to a middleware server who checks which devices were removed or added to that particular smart group, and then sends out MDM commands to, in this case, change the desktop background. So the desktop background turned red, but of course you are already thinking about other things you can do that probably wouldn't demo so well, but be actually useful. So I'm going to go in, because I don't like the red background, and reinstate the passcode. And it will take a few seconds, because A, the device doesn't check in that often, but also for all of the communication to happen, and then the wallpaper changes back again. So I've used Torq as the middleware. Middleware is a server that communicates with multiple different APIs. The Jamf Pro webhook comes in here, and I can see this is the information in Java, and there's a group added devices, and there would be a group remove devices in case it fell out of the smart group. And then we see the same thing again. We generate the access token to talk with Jamf Pro, we loop through the remove devices, and then we send a create wallpaper command. And in this case, we're also sending a Slack message. Could also do Teams, but I happen to have a Slack server around here. And if I go in here in workflows, we can see like 4:06 p.m. Yeah, that's right now. This is on European time zone. It tells me this device fell out of the group and then back again. And I can also link into the Jamf interface. Let me just log in here. Do this again. Show. It will take me direct to that computer's record. So that's useful. But I can also, now hold this up for a moment, say, I want to lock this device. Could be wipe, could be some other thing that you want to do. And just in a few seconds, my device locks. So I'm talking with multiple different servers, building kind of a Ruby Goldberg machine. So again, the device changed some internal state, in this case, the passcode, which moves it into a different smart group in Jamf Pro. It sends a webhook informing a different server, in this case, the Torq middleware server, but it could be Microsoft Power Automate or Okta Workflows or any of these others, Jamf routines, informs a different server of this change. The server processes that, sends an API call back to Jamf Pro to say, hey, this device needs a new desktop, or this device needs to be locked, or some other thing, and Jamf Pro does the thing that needs to be doing. And because we're there, we also sent an update to a messaging system, which in itself can trigger other workflows, and on and on. I already demoed this. I did all of that earlier. We can build great things with APIs. There's a few things you probably don't want to do. I've mentioned this earlier, don't test in production. Rich Troughton, very wise person, said, we all have a test environment. Some of us are lucky enough to have it separate from our production environment. If you don't have a Jamf test environment yet, talk to your CSM or SE or account executive. We will set one up for you, and that you can use. And especially when working with the API, there's a lot of potential for accidental harm. You don't want to be starting out working on live data. There's a lot of discussion online. The general rule is don't put passwords or secrets in clear text. Whether you send them as arguments or put them in your script, they are in clear text. This is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. It's an ideal that we should strive for, but it's nearly impossible to achieve in practice. What you do want to do is minimize access privileges. The client ID secret technology in Jamf Pro allows us to have a different client ID secret and different access privileges for every script and every automation that you build. And that's what you should do. And then rotate those passwords in a frequency that makes sense to your workflows, just to minimize the potential for abuse. Another way is if you export the workflows into a middleware server, like what I just showed with Torq or Power Automate or Okta Workflows, etc., those will hold the client ID secret, and those usually have secure ways of holding them. It's much harder to attack that and get the access privileges from that than from reading out a text file script that's on every client. I've seen people create a new token for each API call, super complicated workflows, and they create a new token for each call, effectively doubling the number of requests to the server. And if you have that running on several hundred or thousand max, not so good. The server will not like that. Generally, you want to reduce the traffic to the server. Just because you can call the APIs doesn't mean you should do it all the time. One thing is like calling APIs from extension attributes. Don't do that. Just too noisy, too much traffic against the server. Our cloud hosting team will not like you if you do that. And while APIs are great, don't forget the other tools that we have, like especially with Jamf Pro, the Jamf binary, which allows me to update data in Jamf Pro without needing API calls, because the Jamf binary can already do that. So check the other tools. Do I actually need to do API calls? because if you don't, you can avoid all of this. I've mentioned a few tools, and again, I will link to a resource page in a moment. API utility from Leslie Hillou on concepts.jamf.com. Really great. I've used it for experimentation. I'm starting to build scripts with API utility because it saves so much work. There's a very popular app for working with APIs called Postman, and my coworker Rob Potvin, who's not in the room, oh, he's presenting right now at the same time, has a great blog article on how to use Postman with the Jamf Pro API. Jamf Routines is a middleware that we have, no-code middleware, which has a limited amount of workflows, but can give you an idea of what you can do with that and be a good starting point. If you're looking into working with Swift, check out the tutorial that I made 3 years ago for JNL. It still works, it's still current. Swift Argument Parser is a great tool for writing Swift command line tools in general. And there's a package called Swift Open API, which can automatically generate the code needed to work with APIs. And it kind of, sort of, mostly works with Jamf Pro. And Bryson Tyrrell has a great blog post on that. Developer.jamf.com. If you remember one link, that's the one. On the marketplace, you might find integrations and solutions built with the API, so you don't have to. It's always great if somebody else built it first, and you can use it or buy it. And then finally, jamf.it/JNL25-API, all the links, resources, and other things that I have mentioned today. So these are the two that I highlighted. I built a tutorial for JNUG 2022, 6-part tutorial on how to build a Swift command line tool, the one I showed just now, and then a fairly simple Swift UI app that talks with Jamf Pro. And a coworker, Ant Dallo, actually took that and then used it to talk with Jamf School. So it's transferable. Rob Potvin's blog post on using Postman. And with that, you get the link again. And thank you very much.